Victoria Ashford's voice cut through Lumiere restaurant like a blade. "This is absolutely unacceptable. I asked for the wine list 20 minutes ago, and this incompetent girl brings me tap water in a dirty glass." The crystal stemware shattered against the marble floor as Elena Martinez froze mid-stride, 200 pairs of eyes turning toward the chaos. Elena Martinez froze mid-stride, 200 pairs of eyes turning toward table 7, where Victoria Ashford sat rigid in her tailored Armani blazer, her manicured fingers still extended from the violent gesture. "This is absolutely unacceptable." Victoria's voice cut through the ambient jazz like a blade, her words dripping with the kind of entitled fury that money could buy but class couldn't teach. "I asked for the wine list 20 minutes ago, and this incompetent girl brings me tap water in a dirty glass." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained carefully neutral as she knelt to collect the larger shards. The glass hadn't been dirty. She'd polished it herself just minutes before, but arguing with customers, especially ones who could afford the $300 tasting menu, was a luxury she couldn't afford, not with her mother's medication costs and mounting bills. "Ma'am, I apologize for any inconvenience," Elena said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Let me get you a fresh glass and bring that wine list right away." Victoria's laugh was sharp and brittle. "Don't you ma'am me, girl. Do you have any idea who I am? I'm Victoria Ashford, CEO of Ashford Enterprises, and I won't be treated like this by the help." The word help landed like a slap. But there was something else now, something that had been building for months as she moved through the city's most exclusive establishments, watching and listening and taking careful notes that no one suspected a mere waitress would be capable of understanding. Marcus Chen, the head sommelier, appeared at Elena's elbow with practiced grace. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his movements fluid from 20 years of navigating volatile situations with wealthy clientele. "Mrs. Ashford, please allow me to handle this personally. Elena, why don't you attend table 12 while I take care of Mrs. Ashford's needs?" Elena nodded gratefully, but as she straightened with the dustpan full of glass, Victoria's voice pursued her like a hunting dog. "And make sure she washes her hands before touching anyone else's food. God knows what kind of diseases someone like that might be carrying." The restaurant fell into the kind of silence that precedes either violence or revelation. Elena felt every gaze boring into her back, felt the weight of assumptions and judgments settling on her shoulders like lead blankets. She thought of the federal badge locked away, her true identity hidden beneath months of careful construction. At table 12, Harold Pemberton adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked up from his leather-bound menu with kind eyes that reminded Elena of her late father. He was a regular, always polite, always tipped well despite ordering modestly. Tonight he wore a rumpled cardigan that had seen better decades, and there was something almost apologetic in his expression. "Rough night?" he asked quietly as Elena refilled his water glass with hands that had finally stopped shaking. "Nothing I can't handle, Mr. Pemberton. Have you decided on an appetizer?" Harold's gaze drifted toward Victoria's table, where the CEO was now gesticulating wildly at Marcus, her voice carrying across the dining room like nails on a chalkboard. "Some people," he murmured, "mistake cruelty for strength. They never realize how much strength it actually takes to be kind." Elena paused in the act of straightening his silverware, struck by the unexpected wisdom in his words. There was something in Harold's tone, a weight of experience that spoke of battles fought and lessons learned the hard way. She found herself looking at him more closely, noticing details that she'd somehow missed in their previous interactions. The way his eyes tracked movement throughout the restaurant, the subtle alertness beneath his grandfatherly exterior. "You sound like you speak from experience," she said, her professional mask slipping just slightly. Harold's smile was sad and knowing. "I've seen my share of bullies over the years, dear. In boardrooms, in government, in places where power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The trick is remembering that their noise doesn't make them right." Before Elena could respond, a fresh wave of Victoria's vitriol crashed across the dining room. This is what happens when restaurants lower their standards. You hire these people and they bring down the entire establishment. I bet she's not even legal. Probably one of those illegals taking jobs from real Americans. Elena's pen snapped in her grip. Before I continue with what happens next, I need you to pause and think about this moment. How many times have you witnessed someone being treated like this? If this story is resonating with you, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Trust me, you won't believe what Elena does next. The casual racism, delivered with such practiced ease, hit harder than any physical blow could have. She felt Harold's eyes on her, felt the collective intake of breath from nearby tables, felt the careful attention of every server and busboy who shared her brown skin and knew exactly what Victoria meant by these people. At the bar, Isabella Romano, the restaurant's manager, gripped the mahogany edge so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Isabella had worked her way up from hostess to manager over 8 grueling years, and she'd dealt with difficult customers before. But Victoria's particular brand of entitled cruelty was testing the limits of her professional composure. Elena watched Isabella's internal struggle play out across her expressive features, the desire to defend her employee, warring with the practical reality of running a business dependent on wealthy clientele. The restaurant's owner, Jean-Pierre Dubois, emerged from the kitchen with the kind of thunderous expression that suggested he'd heard every word. His chef's whites were pristine despite the dinner rush, and his usually jovial face had hardened into something that would have made lesser mortals flee. Jean-Pierre had built Lumière from nothing, transforming a failed diner into one of the city's most respected establishments through sheer force of will and an unwavering commitment to treating every person who walked through his doors with dignity. Mrs. Ashford, Jean-Pierre's French accent added weight to each syllable. I believe there has been a misunderstanding. Victoria turned on him with the fury of someone accustomed to having her tantrums indulged. The only misunderstanding is your decision to employ substandard staff. I've been dining here for 5 years, and the service has never been this appalling. Elena continued taking Harold's order, her movements automatic, while her mind cataloged every word, every gesture, every revealing detail of Victoria's meltdown. This wasn't just about a glass of wine or slow service. This was about power and casual cruelty disguised as authority. The duck confit sounds lovely, Harold said, though his attention remained fixed on the drama unfolding across the restaurant. Tell me, Elena, that is your name, isn't it? How long have you been working here? 6 months, Elena replied, struck again by the odd intensity of his interest. And before that? Elena met his eyes, seeing something there that made her pulse quicken. Before that, I was between opportunities. Harold nodded slowly, as if her careful non-answer told him exactly what he needed to know. I imagine someone with your qualifications might find this kind of work rather limiting. The word qualifications hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Elena felt a chill of recognition, the kind that comes when 2 people playing carefully constructed roles suddenly glimpse the truth beneath each other's masks. Victoria's voice rose to a new octave of outrage. I demand to speak to the owner. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what kind of establishment this really is. My company has connections with health inspectors, labor boards, immigration services. I can shut this place down with a phone call. Elena had heard enough. For 6 months, she'd watched people like Victoria destroy lives with casual cruelty. Not tonight. She reached into her apron pocket and withdrew something small and leather-bound. The threat landed with the weight of absolute certainty. She had seen it before, the casual way people like Victoria wielded their power like clubs, destroying lives and livelihoods with the same thoughtless ease they might swat a fly. She thought of the other servers, many of them immigrants working multiple jobs to support families back home, and felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. Isabella finally moved from behind the bar, her steps measured and professional despite the fire in her dark eyes. "Mrs. Ashford, I understand you're upset, but threatening our staff is not acceptable. Perhaps we could—" "Don't you dare lecture me about what's acceptable." Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor like a scream. "I've spent thousands of dollars in this establishment, and I won't be spoken to like this by some glorified waitress." The insult to Isabella, who held an MBA from Wharton and spoke 4 languages, was the final straw. Elena felt the careful control she'd maintained for 6 months begin to crack. She thought of her real job, of the authority she carried in her other life, of all the times she'd had to bite her tongue and swallow her pride in service of a larger purpose. Jean-Pierre stepped between Victoria and Isabella, his presence commanding despite his compact stature. "Madame, I must ask you to lower your voice. You are disturbing my other guests." "Your other guests?" Victoria's laugh was hysterical now, sharp-edged and dangerous. "Look around, you pompous little man. Half your customers are probably just like her. Illegals and welfare queens pretending they belong in civilized society. This whole place is a joke, a pathetic imitation of real class." The restaurant had gone dead silent now, the only sounds the soft jazz still playing and the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Elena felt the weight of every stare, the collective held breath of staff and patrons alike, all waiting to see how this would resolve. Harold cleared his throat softly, drawing Elena's attention back to his table. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've always found that the people who shout loudest about class usually have the least of it." Elena almost smiled, despite everything. "My grandmother used to say something similar. She'd say that real quality doesn't need to announce itself. It just is." "A wise woman, your grandmother." "She was. She also used to say that everyone gets what's coming to them, eventually. Karma has a way of keeping score." Harold's eyes crinkled with something that might have been amusement. "Karma, yes. Or perhaps justice. Sometimes they're the same thing." Victoria was building to a crescendo now, her voice reaching levels that surely violated several noise ordinances. "I want that girl fired immediately, or I'm walking out that door and taking my business and the business of everyone I know with me. Do you understand what that means? Do you have any idea how much influence I have in this city?" Elena set Harold's menu aside and walked back toward Victoria's table, her steps sure and steady. She could feel Isabella's warning look, Jean-Pierre's concerned frown, Marcus's barely concealed panic. But she could also feel something else, a sense of rightness, of a moment that had been building toward this revelation for months. "Mrs. Ashford," Elena said, her voice cutting through the chaos with quiet authority, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Victoria whirled on her, face flushed with rage and self-righteousness. "You! How dare you interrupt me? Security should throw you out on the street where you belong." Elena reached into her apron pocket and withdrew something small and leather-bound. She held it for a moment, feeling its familiar weight, then flipped it open with practiced precision. The badge caught the restaurant's ambient lighting and threw it back in sharp, official gleams. The room seemed to inhale collectively, a sharp intake of breath that spoke of shifted power dynamics and upended assumptions. "Mrs. Ashford," Elena said again, her voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm Inspector Elena Martinez with the Federal Labor Standards Administration, and I believe we need to have a very serious conversation about your business practices." Victoria's face went white. "You're lying," she whispered. "I'm Inspector Elena Martinez, Federal Labor Standards Administration, and you've just confessed to multiple federal crimes in front of 30 witnesses." Victoria Ashford's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions: shock, disbelief, fury, and finally the dawning recognition of someone who had just stepped into quicksand. Around them, the restaurant held its collective breath, forks suspended midway to mouths, conversations frozen in half-formed sentences. Elena's morning had begun like every other for the past 6 months, with the jarring buzz of her alarm at 5:30 a.m. in her cramped studio apartment 12 blocks from Lumiere. The space was deliberately sparse. A single bed, a kitchenette barely large enough for one person, walls adorned only with a few carefully chosen photographs that painted the picture of Elena Martinez, recent college graduate, working her way up from the bottom. The real Elena's degrees were hidden away, her federal credentials locked in a safe deposit box downtown, her true identity buried beneath layers of carefully constructed fiction. She'd started each day with the same ritual: shower in the narrow stall with its perpetually dripping faucet, dress in the simple uniform of black pants and white button-down that marked her as service industry, and stare at herself in the mirror while mentally preparing for another day of invisible labor and casual humiliation. The woman who looked back at her was a far cry from Inspector Elena Martinez of the Federal Labor Standards Administration, the same Elena who had graduated summa cum laude from Georgetown with degrees in economics and public policy, who had spent 3 years working undercover investigations that had resulted in millions of recovered wages for exploited workers. But every morning, that accomplished woman disappeared behind the mask of Elena the waitress, Elena the struggling immigrant, Elena who was just grateful to have any job at all. The transformation was so complete that sometimes, lying in bed at night, she struggled to remember which version was real. The decision to go undercover came after a particularly devastating case where a prominent restaurant chain had systematically cheated their staff out of overtime pay, manipulated tip reporting, and maintained working conditions that violated every labor law on the books. The case was airtight until the company's legal team arrived with enough high-priced attorneys to staff a small law firm. Witnesses suddenly developed amnesia, documents disappeared, and the whole investigation crumbled under the weight of money and influence.
"We need someone on the inside," her supervisor, Agent Patricia Kovac, had said during the post-mortem meeting. "Someone who can see what really happens when the lawyers and PR teams aren't watching. These places clean up nice when they know government inspectors are coming, but the day-to-day reality is different." Elena had volunteered immediately, driven by memories of her own mother cleaning office buildings at night, coming home with hands cracked from industrial cleaning supplies, and stories about bosses who treated janitors like they were invisible. She'd grown up watching her mother absorb casual cruelty with practiced grace, swallowing indignities for the sake of a paycheck that barely covered rent and groceries. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now faced the same treatment, despite her education, despite her position, despite every advantage she'd fought to earn. Money and power created their own gravitational field, bending reality until the truth became whatever the wealthy decided it should be. Elena's cover story had been crafted with meticulous care. She was Elena Martinez from Phoenix, daughter of immigrants, first in her family to graduate college but struggling to find work in her field. She'd moved to the city with big dreams and little money, taking whatever job she could find while sending resumes into the void. The story was fictional, but the emotions behind it were achingly real. She'd lived that uncertainty, that constant low-level panic of wondering if this month's rent would materialize, that bone-deep fatigue that came from working multiple jobs just to survive. Lumiere had been her third placement. The first restaurant had been a mid-level chain where the violations were obvious and documented within weeks: wage theft, unsafe working conditions, systematic harassment of female staff. The second had been a trendy gastropub where the real crime was pretension rather than policy violation, though the owner's habit of sampling his own wine throughout service had led to some memorably inappropriate behavior. But Lumiere had presented a more complex challenge. On the surface, Jean-Pierre Dubois ran a model establishment. Wages were fair, working conditions met or exceeded standards, and the staff spoke of him with genuine affection rather than fear. It wasn't until Elena had been there for several weeks that she began to notice the subtler dynamics. The way certain VIP customers were handled with kid gloves, regardless of their behavior. The unspoken understanding that complaints from wealthy patrons carried more weight than the dignity of staff members. The real education had come from watching the customers themselves. Elena had served senators and Supreme Court justices, Fortune 500 CEOs and media moguls, tech billionaires and old money aristocrats. She had poured wine for people who made decisions affecting millions of lives over casual dinner conversation, who treated service staff like animated furniture, who casually mentioned tax avoidance strategies that would have funded small countries. Victoria Ashford had been a regular before Elena arrived, according to the other servers. Isabella had briefed the staff on VIP protocols, explaining in carefully neutral terms that Mrs. Ashford expected a certain level of accommodation. "She can be demanding," Isabella had said, which Elena had quickly learned was restaurant code for complete nightmare, but tips well enough to make the abuse worthwhile. Elena's first encounter with Victoria had been relatively mild, a returned appetizer because the temperature wasn't perfect, a lecture about proper wine service, the usual performance of superiority that wealthy customers often felt compelled to deliver. But over the months, Elena had watched Victoria's behavior escalate, particularly toward staff members who couldn't fight back without risking their livelihoods. There was Ramon, the busboy whose English wasn't perfect, but whose work ethic was unquestionable, who had endured Victoria's loud speculation about his legal status while clearing her table with shaking hands. There was Maria, the newest server, barely 18 and still learning the intricate dance of fine dining service, who had fled to the employee bathroom in tears after Victoria's critique of her unprofessional appearance. Apparently, Maria's attempt to tame her naturally curly hair into the restaurant's preferred sleek style wasn't up to Victoria's standards. Elena had comforted both of them, had held her tongue while rage built pressure behind her carefully maintained smile, and had filed mental notes that would eventually become part of a comprehensive report on workplace harassment and hostile environment violations. But each incident had chipped away at her professional detachment, had made the weight of her hidden badge feel heavier in her dresser drawer. The breaking point had been last Tuesday, when Victoria had demanded that Carlos, the prep cook, be fired because she'd glimpsed him through the kitchen service window and decided his tattoos were unprofessional and probably gang-related. Carlos was a veteran who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, whose tattoos were military honors and remembrances of fallen comrades, who worked 2 jobs to support his disabled sister and her kids. Jean-Pierre had quietly transferred Carlos to day-shift prep work, away from Victoria's line of sight, but the compromise had felt like collaboration. Elena had gone home that night and stared at her reflection for a long time, wondering when staying in character had become indistinguishable from cowardice. Now, with her badge finally in the open and Victoria's face cycling through shades of red that suggested either apoplexy or stroke, Elena felt the familiar rush of authority returning. It was like slipping into a well-tailored coat after months of wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. "You're lying," Victoria sputtered, but her voice had lost its imperious edge. "You're just a waitress. This is some kind of joke."
Elena's smile was thin and professional. "I assure you, Mrs. Ashford, this is no joke. I've been conducting a comprehensive investigation into labor practices and workplace harassment in the hospitality industry. You've provided me with quite a bit of valuable data tonight." Harold Pemberton rose from his table and walked over, his grandfatherly demeanor shifting subtly as he moved. Elena noticed details she'd missed before. The way he carried himself, the alertness in his eyes, the small pin on his lapel that she now recognized as a union insignia. "Harold Pemberton," he said, extending a hand to Elena, "Regional Director, AFL-CIO. I've been wondering when you'd surface, Inspector Martinez. Your reputation precedes you. Elena shook his hand, pieces clicking into place. Harold's careful questions, his obvious interest in her background, his presence at a restaurant far above his apparent means. He'd been watching her as carefully as she'd been watching everyone else. Mr. Pemberton, I should have recognized the signs earlier. You were maintaining excellent cover. I only suspected because I've worked with Patricia Kovac on several joint investigations. She mentioned they had someone deep undercover in the restaurant scene. Isabella approached slowly, her expression a mixture of awe and barely contained glee. Inspector Martinez? We had no idea. Is Elena even your real name? It is. Most of my cover story was true, actually. I am the daughter of immigrants. I did grow up watching my mother work multiple jobs, and I do understand what it's like to be invisible in the eyes of people who consider themselves superior. Elena's gaze swept the room, taking in the faces of servers and customers alike. The only difference is that I chose this invisibility as a tool, rather than having it imposed on me by circumstances. Jean-Pierre had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now he stepped forward with the careful deliberation of someone navigating a minefield. Inspector, I hope you found our establishment to be in compliance with all regulations. We pride ourselves on treating our staff with respect and maintaining the highest standards. Elena considered her words carefully. Jean-Pierre wasn't the enemy here. He was a decent man trying to run a business in a system that often punished decency and rewarded cruelty. But he wasn't entirely innocent either. His willingness to accommodate customers like Victoria, to sacrifice his staff's dignity for the sake of profit margins, had created the environment that allowed abuse to flourish. That will be determined by the full investigation, she said diplomatically. But I will say that the primary issues I've observed have involved customer behavior rather than management policy. Victoria had been fumbling with her phone, but now she looked up with an expression of desperate calculation. You can't seriously be planning to what? Arrest me? For what? Being demanding? Having standards? For creating a hostile work environment through systematic harassment based on race and national origin. For making specific threats against employees based on their perceived immigration status. For using your economic power to intimidate and humiliate workers. Would you like me to continue? Those people work for me. Not directly, but they depend on customers like me for their livelihoods. If I don't like the service, I have every right to. You have the right to complain about service. You don't have the right to engage in discriminatory harassment. You don't have the right to create a hostile work environment for employees based on their race or perceived national origin. And you certainly don't have the right to threaten people's livelihoods as retaliation for filing complaints or asserting their rights. The distinction seemed lost on Victoria, whose worldview apparently didn't include categories for rights I don't have. Her face was settling into the mulish expression of someone preparing to dig in for a long fight. This is America. I built my company from nothing. I provide jobs for thousands of people. I won't be lectured by some affirmative action hire pretending to be important. The casual racism in the phrase affirmative action hire landed like a physical blow, but Elena had been expecting it. In her experience, people like Victoria always revealed their true beliefs when cornered, like animals baring their teeth before the final attack.
I earned my position through merit, Mrs. Ashford. Magna cum laude from Georgetown, top 10% of my class at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, exemplary performance reviews for 5 consecutive years. But even if I hadn't, even if I were exactly what you seem to think I am, just a waitress, just an immigrant, just someone struggling to make ends meet, I would still deserve to be treated with basic human dignity. Elena felt the weight of every eye in the restaurant, felt the collective intake of breath that suggested her words had hit their mark. This wasn't just about her anymore, or even about Victoria. This was about every person who'd ever been dismissed, demeaned, or dehumanized by someone who confused wealth with worth. The revelation had shifted the restaurant's atmosphere like a sudden change in barometric pressure. Elena felt the weight of eyes upon her, some curious, some grateful, others calculating the implications of this dramatic reversal. Victoria Ashford stood frozen in a tableau of suspended disbelief, her phone clutched in her manicured fingers like a weapon she'd forgotten how to use. Elena had witnessed this moment countless times in her career, the instant when someone accustomed to absolute power suddenly discovered its limits. Victoria's face cycled through micro-expressions of rage, panic, and desperate calculation as her mind struggled to process a reality where the help held actual authority. But Elena also recognized the dangerous glitter in Victoria's eyes. Wealthy, powerful people didn't surrender easily, and they rarely went down without trying to take others with them. The CEO's initial shock was already hardening into something more tactical, more vengeful. "You think you're so clever," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper that somehow carried further than her earlier shouting. "You think this little performance gives you some kind of victory. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Elena kept her expression neutral, but internally she was cataloging threats and calculating responses. This was the moment when investigations either succeeded or died, when the targets either acknowledged wrongdoing or escalated into full warfare. "I know exactly who you're dealing with, Mrs. Ashford. Victoria Ashford, CEO of Ashford Enterprises, a company currently under review by multiple federal agencies for labor violations, environmental compliance issues, and tax irregularities. Age 52, divorced twice, no children. Net worth approximately $800 million, most of it inherited from your father's defense contracting business." Victoria's face went white. "How dare you?" "It's public record, Mrs. Ashford. Your company's regulatory filings, divorce proceedings, SEC investigations, all available to anyone who knows where to look." Elena's tone remained conversational, but her words carried the weight of institutional power. "What's not public yet is the comprehensive file I've been building on your pattern of discriminatory behavior, your use of economic threats to silence complaints, and your company's systemic exploitation of immigrant workers." The phone in Victoria's hand began to shake. "You're fishing. You're some low-level bureaucrat trying to make a name for yourself by attacking successful people. My lawyers will." "Your lawyers will advise you to cooperate with the federal investigation, just as they did during the EPA review of your Newark facility and the DOL investigation into your warehouse operations in Phoenix and the IRS audit of your executive compensation packages." Each revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. Elena watched the woman's confident facade crumble as she realized that this wasn't a random encounter. This was the result of months of methodical investigation, of connections being drawn across multiple agencies and jurisdictions. Harold Pemberton stepped closer, his union credentials now openly displayed on his jacket. "Mrs. Ashford, I've been documenting labor violations in your company for over 2 years. The AFL-CIO has received dozens of complaints from your employees: wage theft, unsafe working conditions, retaliation against union organizers. We've been waiting for the right moment to coordinate with federal authorities." Victoria's gaze darted between Elena and Harold, recognition dawning that she hadn't just stumbled into a trap, she had walked into a carefully orchestrated sting operation. "This is entrapment. This is a setup. You can't use evidence gathered through deception." Undercover investigations are perfectly legal when conducted by authorized federal agents. Everything I've witnessed here tonight has been your genuine behavior, observed in a public setting with multiple witnesses present. No entrapment required. The restaurant's other patrons had become an audience to history in the making. Elena noticed how the dynamics had shifted. Servers stood straighter, customers leaned forward in their chairs, and even the background jazz seemed to have paused in recognition of the drama unfolding. At table 15, Senator Margaret Walsh, whom Elena recognized from her 3 previous visits, discreetly activated her phone's recording function. The senator had always been polite to staff, tipping generously and never raising her voice, but Elena had watched her carefully nonetheless. Politicians were often the most dangerous customers, their public personas masking private calculations that could destroy careers with a single phone call. But tonight, Senator Walsh's expression showed something Elena hadn't expected: relief, as if she'd been waiting for someone to finally confront the kind of behavior she'd witnessed but felt powerless to address directly. Victoria noticed the senator's attention and turned toward her with desperate help. "Margaret, thank God. You know me. You know what kind of person I am. Tell them this is all some kind of misunderstanding." Senator Walsh's response was carefully measured, delivered in the neutral tone of someone who understood that every word would be scrutinized later. "Victoria, I think it would be best if you listen to what the inspector has to say." The abandonment by her political ally hit Victoria like a slap. Elena watched the woman's last hope of easy rescue evaporate, replaced by the dawning realization that her behavior had been witnessed and judged by everyone in the room. Isabella had been standing near the bar, her manager's instincts warring with her personal satisfaction at seeing Victoria finally held accountable. Now she approached with careful steps, her voice pitched to carry just far enough. "Inspector Martinez," Isabella said formally, "I want to state for the record that Elena, that is, you, have been an exemplary employee during your time here. Professional, hardworking, respectful to customers and colleagues alike. The behavior we've witnessed tonight from Mrs. Ashford is unfortunately not uncommon, but it's never been addressed because—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Because customers who spend large amounts of money are often allowed to behave in ways that wouldn't be tolerated from anyone else." Elena nodded, recognizing Isabella's courage in speaking truth to power. The manager was risking her own position by making such a statement, but she was also creating an official record of the systemic issues Elena had been investigating. Jean-Pierre emerged from the kitchen again, this time accompanied by two other figures: his sous chef, Marie Dubois, his daughter, Elena realized with surprise, and the restaurant's accountant, David Kim, who appeared to have been hastily summoned from home based on his casual clothes and disheveled hair. "Inspector," Jean-Pierre said heavily, "if you are investigating labor practices, I want to provide you with complete cooperation. David has brought our employment records, payroll documentation, and compliance files. We have nothing to hide." Elena appreciated the gesture, but she also recognized it as the move of a businessman protecting his interests. Jean-Pierre was drawing a clear line between his establishment's policies and Victoria's behavior. Smart positioning, but also genuine concern for his employees. Victoria's phone finally buzzed with an incoming call, and she answered it with the desperation of a drowning person grabbing a life ring. "Richard? Thank God. I'm at Lumiere, and there's some kind of situation." "What do you mean you've heard? From who?" Elena couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but Victoria's face provided a running commentary of shock, disbelief, and growing panic. Whoever Richard was, lawyer, friend, or business associate, he wasn't delivering the support Victoria had expected. "No, I understand, but Richard, you can't just— We've worked together for 15 years!" Victoria's voice rose again, but now it carried the thin edge of desperation rather than authority. "Fine, fine. See how that works out for you when I'm vindicated." She ended the call and stood holding the phone like it had personally betrayed her. Elena recognized the moment when powerful people discovered that their networks of influence were actually networks of convenience, maintained only as long as the association was profitable or safe. "Problem with your legal representation?" Victoria's laugh was bitter and slightly hysterical. "Richard Steinberg, senior partner at Morrison, Steinberg & Associates. Been my company's primary counsel for over a decade. Apparently he's suddenly too busy to take my calls." Harold made a sympathetic noise. "Word travels fast in certain circles. Lawyers are often the first to distance themselves when federal investigations heat up. Self-preservation instinct." "This is insane," Victoria muttered, but the fight was draining out of her voice. "I haven't done anything illegal. I was rude to a waitress. Maybe I lost my temper. People lose their tempers all the time." Elena felt a flicker of something that might have been pity. Victoria seemed genuinely unable to understand the difference between losing one's temper and engaging in systematic harassment. The woman had been so insulated by wealth and power that she'd lost the ability to recognize her own cruelty. "Mrs. Ashford," Elena said more gently, This isn't about losing your temper. This is about a pattern of behavior that creates hostile work environments for employees. It's about using your economic power to intimidate and demean people who can't fight back without risking their livelihoods. They are subhuman, Victoria snapped, the mask finally slipping completely. These people chose their stations in life. They chose to be waitresses and busboys and kitchen help. If they don't like how they're treated, they can get better jobs.
You know, when I started the food truck, I had customers who looked at me like I was invisible, like I was just part of the equipment, there to serve them and then disappear. It used to make me so angry I could barely sleep. Maya set down her clothes and looked at her father. This was a story she'd never heard before. What changed? I realized they weren't seeing me. They were seeing what they expected to see. Just another immigrant with a food truck. Not someone who'd spent years perfecting every recipe, who knew more about flavor profiles and ingredient sourcing than most of the chefs in their fancy restaurants. Carlos smiled, but there was an edge to it. So I decided to show them who I really was. Not through words, but through work. Through excellence, they couldn't ignore it. Did it work? Sometimes. The ones that mattered, yes. The ones who didn't, Carlos shrugged. Their loss. Maya felt something loosen in her chest. Her father understood and had been through his own version of what she'd experienced with Richard. But there was something else in his tone, a question he wasn't quite asking. "Papi," she said carefully, "what if someone told you that there was a reason you were running a food truck instead of a restaurant? Maybe you just weren't cut out for something bigger." Carlos's expression hardened, and for a moment Maya could see the younger man he'd been, hungrier, angrier, more willing to fight for every scrap of respect. "I'd tell them to come back in 5 years and see what I built." His voice was quiet, but steel strong. "And if they still thought I wasn't cut out for success, I'd invite them to explain it to my customers, my employees, and my daughter who grew up in a business I built from nothing." Maya felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Her father's faith in her was absolute, unwavering, sometimes overwhelming in its intensity. "What if I wanted to build something even bigger?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. "What if I wanted to prove that I could create something extraordinary?" Carlos was quiet for so long that Maya wondered if she'd overstepped, revealed too much of the ambition that felt almost greedy in its scope. "Mija," he said finally, "I built this place for a lot of reasons. To support our family, to serve good food, to have something that was mine." He gestured around the restaurant, taking in every carefully chosen detail. "But mostly, I built it so that you would have choices. So that when you were ready to build something of your own, you'd have the knowledge, the experience, and the foundation to build it right." Maya stared at her father, feeling something fundamental shift in her understanding of their relationship, of her place in the family business. "You always knew I'd want something more?" "I hoped you would. You have gifts, Maya, not just knowledge, but vision. You see possibilities that I never could. This place," he gestured around Corazon again, "this is my dream fulfilled. But you were born to dream bigger." The conversation was interrupted by the lunch rush beginning to trickle in, but Maya carried her father's words with her as she moved through the rest of her shift. The validation was intoxicating, but it also made her more aware of the gap between her current reality and her aspirations. That evening, after her UCLA extension class on advanced restaurant operations, Maya sat in her apartment with her laptop open, working on the business plan that had become her obsession. She'd been refining it for 2 years, adjusting projections, researching locations, dreaming in spreadsheets and floor plans. The concept was ambitious, a restaurant that would showcase the sophistication of Mexican and Latin American cuisine while honoring its roots. Not fusion, but elevation. Taking the techniques and flavor profiles she'd learned growing up in her father's kitchen and applying them with the precision and presentation of haute cuisine. She'd calculated that she needed $350,000 to do it right, enough for a good location, quality equipment, proper marketing, and operating capital for the first year.
Her current savings account held $23,847. At her current rate of saving, accounting for tuition payments and living expenses, she'd have the money she needed in approximately never. Maya closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of impossibility settle on her shoulders. Richard's words echoed again. There's usually a reason for that. Maybe he was right. Maybe ambition without capital was just delusion. Maybe she should be grateful for what she had. A steady job, a path toward management at Corazon, a comfortable if unremarkable future in the family business. But as she prepared for bed, her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed her father's eyes, his stubborn chin, the same expression of quiet determination that had carried Carlos from a food truck to a successful restaurant. She thought about his story, about customers who had seen only what they expected to see, about excellence that couldn't be ignored.
The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Elena heard the sharp intake of breath from servers throughout the restaurant, saw Maria's eyes fill with tears, watched Ramon's hands clench into fists at his sides. This was it, the moment when Victoria's true beliefs finally emerged without pretense or a political calculation. "There it is," Elena said quietly. "The real Victoria Ashford. Thank you for making your position so clear." But Victoria wasn't finished. The dam had burst, and years of carefully contained contempt came flooding out. "You know what I really think? I think this country has gone completely insane, catering to every sob story and victim narrative. These people come here illegally, take jobs from Americans, and then have the audacity to complain about working conditions? In my father's day, people were grateful for honest work." Elena's jaw tightened. "Your father's day included segregation, Mrs. Ashford. Are you suggesting that was an improvement?" "I'm suggesting that people knew their place. There was order. There was respect for authority. There was systematic oppression," Harold interjected, his grandfatherly demeanor replaced by something steelier. "I was there for your Father's Day, Mrs. Ashford. I remember when people like you could destroy careers with a whisper, when workers had no protections, when speaking up meant being blacklisted. Your nostalgia is for a time when your kind of cruelty went unchallenged." Victoria turned on him with venomous fury. "My kind. Who do you think you are, you pathetic old man? You probably never earned an honest dollar in your life, just lived off union dues stolen from hardworking Americans. I'm Harold Pemberton, and I've spent 43 years fighting for workers' rights. I was there when your father's company was cited for safety violations that killed 6 workers in 1987. I was there when Ashford Enterprises was forced to pay $18 million in back wages to exploited immigrants in 2003. I was there when your company tried to break the steelworkers union by hiring private security to intimidate picket lines. So yes, Mrs. Ashford, I know exactly what your family's legacy really is." Each revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. Elena watched the woman's face cycle through rage, shock, and something approaching genuine fear as she realized that her past was being laid bare in front of a room full of witnesses. The restaurant's atmosphere had shifted again. What had begun as dinner theater was becoming a public tribunal, with Victoria as both defendant and key witness against herself. Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This was no longer just about labor violations or workplace harassment. This was about justice, accountability, and the fundamental question of whether wealth could continue to insulate people from the consequences of their actions. At table 8, Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Marcus the sommelier, had been listening with the focused attention of someone accustomed to observing human behavior under stress. As the city's chief medical examiner, she'd seen how power corrupted, how wealth enabled cruelty, how systems of privilege protected the guilty while sacrificing the innocent. Now, she rose from her table and approached the group with measured steps. "Excuse me," Dr. Chen said politely, "but I feel compelled to add something to this discussion. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, Chief Medical Examiner for the city.
In my professional capacity, I've investigated several workplace fatalities at companies owned or contracted by Ashford Enterprises. The pattern of safety violations, inadequate training, and corporate negligence has been concerning. Victoria's face went gray. You're lying. Our safety record is exemplary. We follow all OSHA regulations. Your companies follow the absolute minimum required by law, Dr. Chen corrected, and sometimes not even that. The elevator accident at your downtown construction site last year, the chemical exposure at your textile facility, the warehouse fire that trapped workers behind locked emergency exits. Each of those incidents was preventable, Mrs. Ashford. Each of those deaths was avoidable. Alina felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Her investigation into labor violations was just one thread in a web of corporate malfeasance that stretched across multiple agencies and jurisdictions. Victoria wasn't just a racist bully. She was the face of systematic exploitation that had been protected by wealth and political connections for decades. "This is a conspiracy," Victoria said, but her voice had lost its earlier conviction. "You people have orchestrated this whole thing to destroy me. You're probably all working together." "Mrs. Ashford," Elena interrupted, "the only conspiracy here is the one you've been running for years. A conspiracy to exploit workers, intimidate whistleblowers, and use your wealth to escape accountability. The difference is that your conspiracy involved actual crimes." Victoria's phone buzzed again, and she glanced at it with the hope of someone expecting rescue. Instead, her face crumpled as she read whatever message had arrived. "No, they can't do this. Not now."
Elena didn't need to see the message to guess its contents. In her experience, federal investigations had a way of triggering corporate panic responses. Boards distancing themselves from embattled executives, business partners canceling contracts, stock prices beginning to slide as news leaked to financial markets. Senator Walsh chose that moment to approach, her political instincts apparently overriding her desire to avoid involvement. "Victoria," she said carefully, "I think you should consider retaining new legal counsel and cooperating fully with the federal investigation. The optics of this situation are challenging." The political euphemism for completely catastrophic wasn't lost on anyone present. Elena watched Victoria's last hope of political protection evaporate as even her Senate ally positioned herself at a safe distance. "Optics?" Victoria's laugh was bitter and desperate. "Margaret, you've taken hundreds of thousands in campaign contributions from my company. You've attended my fundraisers, you voted for legislation I supported, and now you're worried about optics?" Senator Walsh's expression remained carefully neutral, but Elena caught the flash of annoyance in her eyes. Victoria was making the classic mistake of the cornered powerful, dragging others down with her by revealing connections that were supposed to remain discreet. "I've always voted according to my constituents' best interests," Senator Walsh replied diplomatically. "Campaign contributions don't purchase votes, as you well know." "Don't they?" Victoria's voice rose again, fueled by desperation and the dawning realization that she was truly alone. "What about the port expansion bill, the tax credits for manufacturing, the immigration enforcement funding? You voted exactly as I asked, every single time." Elena felt a chill of professional excitement. Victoria was gift-wrapping federal corruption charges, implicating herself and potentially others in pay-to-play schemes that would expand the investigation far beyond labor violations. Senator Walsh's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "I think this conversation has gone far enough. Victoria, I strongly advise you to stop talking until you have legal representation." But Victoria was past taking advice, past calculating consequences. The careful facade she'd maintained for decades was crumbling, revealing the entitled, cruel reality beneath. "Stop talking! Stop talking! I've spent millions keeping politicians like you in office. I've created thousands of jobs. I've built an empire from nothing, and now you want me to stop talking because some affirmative action inspector and her union thug friend want to play hero?" The racist language was back, but now it was accompanied by something even more dangerous, specific details about political corruption that Elena hadn't expected to uncover during a workplace harassment investigation. Harold was taking careful notes now, his union credentials giving him the authority to document potential violations of labor organizing laws. "Mrs. Ashford, are you stating that you used financial contributions to influence Senator Welsh's votes on legislation affecting workers' rights?" "I'm stating that's how the system works. You pay for access, you build relationships, you get results. Everyone knows it, everyone does it. But suddenly I'm the villain for being honest about it?" Elena exchanged glances with Harold, both of them recognizing that Victoria was committing political suicide in the most public way possible. The restaurant had become a courtroom, and Victoria was serving as prosecutor, defendant, and star witness against herself. Isabella had been recording the entire exchange on her phone, her manager's instincts recognizing that this would likely become evidence in multiple investigations. Now she stepped forward with the careful authority of someone documenting history. "For the record, Mrs. Ashford has just admitted to using financial contributions to influence votes on federal legislation. She has also made multiple discriminatory statements based on race and national origin, created a hostile environment for employees, and threatened retaliation for workers for asserting their rights." Elena nodded approvingly. Isabella was thinking like a prosecutor now, creating an official record that would hold up under legal scrutiny. Victoria seemed to realize that she'd crossed a line from which there was no return. Her earlier bravado collapsed completely, replaced by the desperate calculation of someone who just lit her entire life on fire. I didn't mean, you're taking everything out of context. I was upset. I said things I didn't mean." "Which things didn't you mean?" Elena asked relentlessly. "The racist comments about my colleagues, the threats against their livelihoods, the admission of political corruption, the statements about workers being subhuman? Please be specific about which felonies were just heat-of-the-moment mistakes." The word felonies hit Victoria like a physical blow. Elena watched the woman's face as the full scope of her situation finally penetrated her consciousness. This wasn't just about embarrassment or bad publicity. This was about potential criminal charges, federal prison time, the complete destruction of everything she'd built. "I want a lawyer," she whispered finally. "I want a lawyer right now." Elena nodded professionally. "That's certainly your right, Mrs. Ashford. But I should inform you that everything you've said tonight has been witnessed by approximately 30 people, recorded by multiple devices, and will be part of the official federal investigation. Your right to remain silent begins now, but it's a bit late for damage control." Victoria's legs gave out, and she sank back into her chair with the boneless collapse of someone whose world had just ended. Elena felt no satisfaction in the woman's defeat, just the grim professional pride that came with a job well done. But even as Victoria's immediate threat was neutralized, Elena's investigator instincts were already looking ahead. The corruption allegations, the safety violations, the systematic exploitation Harold had documented. This was bigger than one racist CEO having a meltdown in a fancy restaurant. This was the tip of an iceberg that could sink careers, topple governments, and reshape entire industries. Victoria sat in stunned silence as Elena contacted federal backup. The woman who had spent years terrorizing service workers had finally met someone who could fight back. Within hours, Victoria would be facing federal charges, her company under investigation, and her reign of cruelty permanently ended. Sometimes justice comes disguised as a waitress. Elena stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office in the federal building, watching morning traffic flow through the city streets like blood through arteries. The view was spectacular. Government authority had its privileges, but she found herself missing the controlled chaos of restaurant service, the immediate satisfaction of solving problems with her hands rather than her paperwork. The Ashford investigation had become a watershed moment in federal law enforcement, spawning 17 separate prosecutions, congressional hearings, and a complete restructuring of how multiple agencies coordinated white-collar crime investigations.
Elena's promotion to senior inspector had come with commendations from the director himself, but more importantly, it had come with the authority to implement systemic changes that would protect workers across industries. Victoria Ashford had indeed cooperated, providing testimony that had brought down 2 senators, a federal judge, and the CEOs of 4 major corporations. Her detailed confession had revealed a network of corruption so extensive that prosecutors were still unraveling connections 2 years later. In exchange for her cooperation, Victoria had received a relatively lenient sentence of 8 years in federal prison, a punishment that felt both inadequate and inevitable given the realities of the justice system. But the real victory wasn't in Victoria's imprisonment. It was in the changes her downfall had catalyzed. Elena's phone buzzed with a message from Harold Pemberton. Ashford Enterprises settlement finalized. $340 million to affected workers. Thought you'd want to know. She smiled, remembering the union leader's grandfatherly demeanor hiding his steel-trap mind and decades of experience fighting corporate exploitation. The settlement had been the largest labor violation penalty in history, but more importantly, it had established precedents that would protect workers for generations. The Ashford precedent, as legal scholars were calling it, had fundamentally shifted the burden of proof in workplace harassment cases, making it easier for employees to seek justice without fearing retaliation. A knock on her office door interrupted her reverie. "Come in." Isabella Romano entered, looking polished and professional in a navy blazer that spoke of confidence and authority. The former restaurant manager had become Elena's primary liaison for a new federal program that trained hospitality workers to recognize and report workplace violations. "The Chicago pilot program results are in," Isabella said, settling into the chair across from Elena's desk. 93% of participants reported increased confidence in asserting their rights, and we've documented a 40% decrease in reported harassment incidents at participating establishments. Elena felt the deep satisfaction that came with evidence of real change. "That's remarkable progress. How are the employers responding?" "Better than expected, actually. Turns out that when workers feel protected and valued, productivity increases and turnover decreases. Who would have thought treating people with dignity would be good for business?" Isabella's tone carried just enough irony to acknowledge how long it had taken for this obvious truth to be recognized. The intercom on Elena's desk crackled to life. "Inspector Martinez? Senator Walsh is here for your 2 o'clock appointment." Elena exchanged glances with Isabella. Senator Walsh had requested the meeting through official channels, claiming she wanted to discuss new legislation strengthening worker protections. Both women suspected the real purpose was more personal. "Send her in, please." Senator Margaret Walsh entered with the careful bearing of someone walking through a political minefield. Her senatorial confidence was still intact, but Elena noticed signs of strain around her eyes. The investigation into her relationship with Victoria had been thorough and public, even though she had ultimately been cleared of criminal wrongdoing. "Inspector Martinez," Senator Walsh said formally, "thank you for making time to see me." "Senator, please have a seat. I believe you know Isabella Romano, our Director of Hospitality Industry Outreach?"
Senator Walsh nodded politely, but Elena could see her calculating whether Isabella's presence was helpful or problematic for whatever conversation she'd come to have. "Inspector, I wanted to speak with you about the Worker Protection Enhancement Act that's currently in committee. As you know, the legislation was inspired in part by your investigation, and I wanted to ensure we're addressing the real issues you identified in your fieldwork." Elena appreciated the diplomatic language, but she also heard what Walsh wasn't saying, that the senator's political survival depended on being seen as a champion of worker rights rather than a recipient of corporate influence. "The legislation looks comprehensive, Senator. The mandatory reporting requirements, the expanded whistleblower protections, the increased penalties for retaliation, all of these address gaps we've identified in current law." "Good. Good." Senator Walsh seemed genuinely relieved. "I also wanted to apologize for that night at Lumiere. I should have spoken up sooner, should have intervened when I saw how Mrs. Ashford was treating your colleagues. Instead, I prioritized political relationships over basic human decency."
Elena studied the senator's face, looking for signs of political calculation beneath the apparent sincerity. What she saw instead was genuine regret, the kind that came from someone who had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their own moral compromises. Apology accepted, Senator. But more importantly, what are you doing to ensure it doesn't happen again? That's why I'm here. Senator Walsh leaned forward, her political persona giving way to something more authentic. I've introduced legislation requiring full disclosure of all corporate contributions to political campaigns, including indirect donations through PACs and super PACs. I've also proposed creating an independent inspector general position with authority to investigate claims of quid pro quo corruption. Isabella raised an eyebrow. That's surprisingly comprehensive. What changed your mind? The senator was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh her words carefully. That night, watching Mrs. Ashford destroy herself with her own cruelty, I realized how close I'd come to being destroyed alongside her. Not because I was equally guilty, but because I'd been equally willing to look the other way when it benefited me politically. Elena felt a grudging respect for the senator's honesty. Political redemption was often performative, but Walsh seemed to be grappling with genuine self-reflection. The legislation sounds promising, Senator. You'll have our full support during the committee hearings. After Senator Walsh left, Elena and Isabella sat in comfortable silence, both processing the unexpected encounter. Think she means it? Isabella asked finally. I think she's smart enough to know that the old ways of doing business are over. Whether she means it or not, the political incentives now favor worker protection over corporate accommodation. That's the real victory. We've changed the calculation. Elena's computer chimed with an email notification from Jean-Pierre Dubois. The subject line read, "Invitation to celebrate." The message was brief but warm. Dear Inspector Martinez, Lumiere is celebrating its first year as a certified fair wage restaurant. We would be honored if you would join us for a small celebration this evening. Your courage changed not just our establishment, but our entire industry. With gratitude, Jean-Pierre. Elena smiled, remembering the nervous restaurateur who had tried to navigate between customer satisfaction and employee protection. The Fair Wage Certification Program, another offspring of the Ashford investigation, had created financial incentives for restaurants to implement worker-friendly policies. Lumiere was one of the first to volunteer for the pilot program. Want to go to a party? Elena asked. At Lumiere? Absolutely. It'll be good to see the old crew. That evening, Elena found herself back in the restaurant where everything had changed, but the atmosphere was completely different. The dining room buzzed with genuine celebration rather than tension, and the staff moved with confidence rather than fear. Elena was struck by how much more vibrant the space felt when it wasn't polluted by casual cruelty. Maria approached their table with a smile that transformed her entire face. The young server who had once fled to the bathroom in tears now carried herself with unmistakable confidence.
Inspector Martinez, I'm so glad you came. I wanted you to know I'm starting law school in the fall. Georgetown, just like you. I want to help other workers the way you helped us. Elena felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Maria, that's wonderful. You're going to be an incredible advocate. I learned something that night, Maria continued. I learned that my dignity isn't for sale, no matter how much money someone waves around. You showed me that I deserved better, but more importantly, you showed me that better was possible. Similar conversations followed throughout the evening. Ramon had been promoted to shift supervisor and was studying for his citizenship exam. Carlos had started a non-profit organization helping veterans transition to civilian careers in the hospitality industry. Marcus had opened his own wine consulting business, freed from the stress of managing abusive customers. Each story was a small victory, but taken together, they represented something larger, a fundamental shift in the relationship between service and dignity, between economic necessity and human worth. Jean-Pierre raised a toast as the evening wound down.
to Inspector Martinez, who reminded us that justice sometimes comes disguised as a waitress, and to all the workers who refuse to accept that cruelty is just the cost of doing business. Elena felt the weight of the past 2 years settling around her like a comfortable coat. The investigation had been exhausting, the legal proceedings Byzantine, and the media attention overwhelming. But nights like this reminded her why the work mattered. As she prepared to leave, Harold Pemberton appeared at her elbow with the quiet materialism of someone who had perfected the art of strategic timing. "Elena," he said warmly, "walk with me for a moment." They stepped out onto the sidewalk where the investigation had begun, the city lights reflecting off the restaurant's windows like scattered stars. "You know," Harold said contemplatively, 43 years of labor organizing, and I've never seen anything quite like what you accomplished. Not just the investigation, not just the convictions, but the way you changed the conversation itself." Elena shook her head modestly. "I just did my job, Harold. The real heroes were the workers who found the courage to speak up, the managers who chose justice over profit, the prosecutors who took on powerful interests. I was just the catalyst." "That's what the best investigators always say, Elena. But catalysts matter, Elena. They make reactions possible that would never happen otherwise." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city move around them. Elena thought about Victoria Ashford serving her sentence in federal prison, hopefully learning something about the humanity she had spent so long denying in others. She thought about the thousands of workers who would benefit from the legal precedents established by her investigation. She thought about the politicians and executives who now understood that wealth would no longer insulate them from accountability. But mostly, she thought about the simple truth that had driven her into law enforcement in the first place, that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances, and that sometimes it took someone with a badge to remind people of that fundamental fact. "Want to know a secret?" Elena asked. "Always. I miss the restaurant work sometimes. There was something satisfying about solving problems immediately, about seeing the direct impact of your actions. Investigation work is important, but it's all delayed gratification." Harold chuckled. "You could always go back to waitressing. I hear the working conditions have improved significantly in recent years." Elena laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I think I'll stick with federal law enforcement, but I'll never forget what it felt like to be invisible, to have my worth determined by someone else's prejudices. That perspective makes me a better investigator."
And a better person, Harold added. "Don't forget that part." As Elena walked home through the city streets, she passed restaurants and shops where workers moved with the quiet dignity of people who knew their rights were protected. Their voices would be heard, and their humanity was non-negotiable. It wasn't a perfect world. It might never be, but it was a better world than the one that had existed before Victoria Ashford's spectacular downfall. The real legacy of that night at Lumiere wasn't in the headlines or the convictions or the policy changes, though all of those mattered. The real legacy was in the countless individual moments of dignity preserved, of cruelty interrupted, of justice served to people who had been told they didn't deserve it. Elena smiled as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, thinking about tomorrow's cases, tomorrow's challenges, tomorrow's opportunities to remind the world that power without accountability was just tyranny in expensive clothes. She had learned that sometimes the most important battles were fought not in courtrooms or congressional hearing rooms, but in the quiet moments when someone chose to stand up and say, "This is wrong, and it ends now." The glass that had shattered that evening had been more than crystal. It had been the breaking point of a system that allowed wealth to silence conscience, that permitted cruelty to masquerade as business acumen, that turned human dignity into a commodity that could be bought and sold. In its place, something stronger had emerged, the understanding that justice wasn't just an abstract concept,
but a daily choice made by ordinary people who refused to accept that anyone deserved to be treated as less than human. And sometimes, those ordinary people carried federal badges and the authority to make that choice count for something more than just themselves. The city glittered around her as Elena reached her door, each light representing a life, a story, a person whose dignity mattered as much as any CEOs or senators. Tomorrow, she would return to her office, her investigations, her mission to ensure that power served justice rather than the other way around. But tonight, she simply smiled and unlocked her door, knowing that somewhere in the city, workers were going home with their heads held high, their rights protected, and their humanity acknowledged. It was a small victory in an endless war, but it was enough. It had to be enough. What did you think of Elena's incredible transformation from invisible waitress to federal inspector? Stories like this prove that justice can come from the most unexpected places. If you enjoyed this tale of courage and accountability, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more amazing stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Your support helps us bring you these powerful, true stories every week.